Today I want us to talk about a subject that involves a little flask. Now, your King James Version calls it a box, but that's not unusual. But you'll see in the side footnotes a flask. In fact, in France today, they still refer to a tin can as a box. We wouldn't refer to a tin can as a box, would we? A what is a box, but it can also be a tin can. Just so this box, the alabaster box mentioned in Matthew 26, was probably a flask. Sometimes we get a little bit confused. Wait a minute now, which woman was this? The one that dried Jesus' feet, washed them with her tears and with her hair? No, that's a different case. This is a case where a woman pours oil on Jesus' head at the house of a place called Bethany, at the house of Simon the leper. And we read it a few moments ago. Now, when Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, and we don't know a lot about his leprosy, we're simply introduced to it, a woman came to him, unidentified woman at the moment, but we'll see later, with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume, and she poured it upon his head as he reclined at the table. Now, we may think, well, that's somewhat unusual. We wouldn't see someone doing that today. We would feel that was an affront. If someone came and poured oil on your head while you're eating, you might think, what is this nut doing? But that wasn't the case back then. Do you all remember how kings were anointed back in ancient days? You remember how David was anointed with oil, precious oil? Well, this oil cost quite a bit of money, and it was this woman's way of saying she recognized his lordship, his reign, his greatness. And so, therefore, she thought it was an honor. And I'm sure people that saw it realized there was some honor to it, although there was a bit of indignation. The disciples, it said they were indignant when they saw it and said, why this waste? For this perfume might have been sold for a high price and the money given to the poor. Sometimes we see it that way too, don't we? Sometimes we might even have a few people that would begrudge some of the things the church does when it's for maybe the building up and edification of the body, and they think, well, that could have been given for someone else. I suspect that maybe someone might have even thought, well, maybe some of the things we did for Vacation Bible School might have been given in some other area. But let me tell you something. The bringing up of a young child and the impression you make upon a child and the way in which they're taught is very important. And therefore, I do not begrudge the money spent in making Vacation Bible School something that is a learning situation for that young child. And I do not begrudge the effort we put into making it such that it's exciting and so they will remember it. Sometimes you have to do things like that. Many of you do that for your own children, but sometimes we get just a little bit indignant when it involves money involving the brethren or the church. Well, these disciples couldn't see that. We also learn in verses 10 through 13, but Jesus was aware of this, and he said to them, why do you bother the woman? For she's done a good deed to me. The poor you have with you always, but you do not always have me. Now some have thought, well, this is an odd statement coming from Jesus. Is he saying that he's more important than the poor? Is he saying the poor don't count, but I do? Surely, if you know Jesus Christ, this isn't the attitude or the understanding you would have of this verse. He was going away. He was going to be crucified. He was the Son of God. He knew that he was going to have to go back into heaven after his death, burial, and resurrection and ascension. So this act was something that she was doing because he would not be there forever. And that is, at least physically, upon the earth. He still is at the right hand of God. We have a risen Savior, not a dead prophet like we might find in Mecca. But we have a risen Savior who sits at the right hand of God. Well, anyway, he's saying, it is true that you do always have the poor. Now, Jesus is making a statement of fact. Let me ask you this question. Have you ever known a time in world history there have not been poor people? Can you name a time? No, you cannot. Can you name a country anywhere in the world where there isn't at least one poor person? No, you cannot. I suggest today that you could go to Kuwait, Nauru, Switzerland, or any of the world's top per capita income countries today, and you would still find at least one poor person there. Jesus is making a statement of fact. Some 44 years ago, we started a war on poverty, didn't we? And yet we still have the poor today. In fact, some will tell you there are more per capita poor today than we had in 1965. Why is that the case? Well, brethren, we won't get into that. But Jesus was right, wasn't he? Remember, you will always have some poor people. When she poured this perfume upon my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Now, that would be no more today than we would do when we prepare a body for burial, except it was more exotic, perhaps. It was more expensive. It was showing her love. You know, some of us, when we go to the funeral home, they'll say, now we want you to pick out a casket. We'd like you to pick out the kind of, ruffle that goes around the casket. We'd like to know about the pall that goes on it. And sometimes we don't spare as much expense as some may think we should because we want to show our love for that deceased person. Well, it was no different with this woman. She was trying to show Jesus her great love. I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the world, what this woman has done shall be spoken in memory of her. And isn't that true? Aren't we doing it today, this very day? Some 7,000 to 8,000 miles away from where it occurred, we're speaking of that today, and it is a memorial to her. John gives us a little bit more insight into it in John 12. They made him a supper there, and says Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table. Mary, we learn, took the pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Isn't that an interesting situation? His feet by Mary is wiped with this perfume, and it's cleaned with her hair. Now Judas was not too happy with this, and he said he was going to betray him. Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii? Now this is a picture of an ancient Roman denarii and given to the poor people. Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief. And he had the money box and he used to pilfer what was put into it. I wonder how many funds that have been set aside to help the poor over the ages have gone for something else. Not only in private circles, but in government circles. Well, brethren, you and I both know that when the cat is away, the mice will play. And we know this has probably happened over and over and over again in history. Judas was stealing the money out of the box. He really would have stolen this money too, most likely, had it been sold for that. But some were indignantly remarking in Mark's account, back to the one we're talking about, why has this perfume been wasted? It might have been sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor. And they were scolding her. Jesus, as you know, he said, this is a memorial to her that is spoken of her. And of course, we don't want to get this confused with that other event that happened at the place of Simon the Pharisee about the woman and the tears. But you know, God does remember our good deeds. And whosoever in the name of a disciple gives to one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward. Matthew 10:42. So many people have taken works and just ground them into the ground, saying, it doesn't matter what you do. All it matters is you accept the grace of God and have faith. Well, grace is important. Faith is important. But what did Jesus say? He shall not lose his reward. Reward is important. Hebrews 11 verse 6. For whoever comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. The Bible doesn't contradict itself. How does this fit in today with those saying today about the uselessness of any form of works, not understanding, as James 2:20 tells us, faith without works is dead. There is a place for works. It is a place that goes right next to faith and grace and all of our thinking about Jesus. God remembers our good works. And so I say with conviction that it is time we stood up and recognized the way God does see our good works. Not an end in themselves, full of merit, separate and apart from the grace of God. We would never teach that. But a result of a life of grace and realization of what God has done for us. When you do some good work for another person, it is a realization of what God has done in your life and the mercy and grace you've received. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And you see, when we share with others, we're simply passing on the good that God has done for us. God does remember our good deeds, just as he remembered this woman that had this expensive oil.